Today we have Ryan Basden, who's an ethical hacker and a penetration tester. He's a security researcher. He's a practice leader for Renegade Labs at Risk 360. He is the project leader for Kraken, which is a password cracking utility, open source, available on GitHub. A lot of certifications. He's an OSCP, GWAPT, CISA, CEH, and you've been a speaker on the security circuit at BSSides Atlanta, Kennesaw State University, and Georgetown University, where you talked about open source intelligence gathering. And today we're going to talk about the decentralized internet. So Ryan, maybe just to start off, like, we have centralization and decentralization when it comes to technology. Like, can you talk about like the current state today of centralization and what's wrong with that? Why are you concerned with that?
Sure. So it's important to note that basically everybody's concept of what the internet is now is centralized. So when people think of the internet, most of the time they're thinking of the sites they interact with. So for a lot of people, that's Facebook, Twitter, Google, and a whole suite of Google products, maybe Apple products. It's generally 10 to 15 primary services that are all hosted and run by a few companies, Amazon, the list goes on. So with these services all centralized in one place, i.e. run by one single company, all of the data that you are giving to those services, the way people use those services, is all being housed in one location, and therefore is controlled by a single entity or a small group of entities. So that's the way that people interact with the internet now. Not everybody, but most people, most casual users of the internet are using some kind of centralized service for just about every activity. That's not the way the internet was originally intended to be, if you look at old schematics from Tim Berners-Lee's notebooks, but that's what it's become.
So yeah, I mean, I think like everyone's on AWS or Azure or Google Cloud Platform, or everyone's on Facebook or Twitter, social media cloud platforms. Why is that a problem? We've had lots of conversations where you've expressed to me that decentralization is the future and centralization presents some unique risks. Like, why do you care? Why do we care that we're all centralized? What are some of the risks associated with that?
Well, so there's the surface level stuff, right? Lately, for a variety of reasons, centralized services have really been frustrating people of all different kinds for different reasons, different use cases. We don't need to jump into those. But that's the surface level concern. People are getting frustrated with the consequences of centralized services and centralized platforms without realizing those consequences really existed to experience. On a deeper level, if you get into some of the more ethical concerns and the concerns around how technology shapes our lives and shapes the way we can do or say the things we want to do and say, what's really happening with centralized services is we as people, and as people simultaneously, our thoughts, our desires are being funneled into a product model that's morally ambiguous. So we're being fed reasons to use these platforms. We're told that this platform will make your life easier, make you more productive, or connect you with people, but it's unclear if that's the actual agenda that is behind its design. So by accumulating people, and again, all of those things I associated with people, like their thoughts and desires, in mass into single locations, the commodity that it creates allows us, or forces us really, to be in submission to technological overreach, consequences we didn't originally agree to. It affects us in ways in the future that was not part of the deal at first, and so people are getting frustrated with that and they're trying to move away from it, but the options are many and sometimes hard to understand.
What are some examples? Like, I know recently, for example, in politics, Parler was taken down by AWS. So that was a social media site that I think was right-wing, taken down. And whether you agree or disagree with that, it was a big deal that a cloud service provider could take down any social media website.
Right.
AWS had that power to do that.
Right.
You also have like Facebook or Google and others that serve customized ads. So you use the product for free, but they might monetize it by serving you ads, or, during the election, there was the thing about serving you fake news, or like content that was targeted to make you think a certain thing, and even if that wasn't a real article. So those are some concerns. So you mentioned like morally ambiguous. Are there other examples like that come to mind when you think of, hey, look, this is the centralized platform, and this is why we should be concerned about it?
Yeah, I think that I think Facebook, not that Facebook doesn't have enough people picking on it right now, but it's sort of the poster child for this, right? Facebook is maybe the primary way people interact with the internet. It's one of the first things they open on their phones when they take their phone out. It's one of the first websites they browse to, for those people who still use a computer. And whatever's there is there. And the question of whether or not Facebook is responsible for what is on there from a credibility perspective, from an opinion-based perspective, is it being fair to both sides of an opinion on any issue? Is the content vetted? If so, who should be vetting it? If not, should it be vetted at all? Regardless of the answers to those questions, the decisions or indecisions are affecting the way people think and ultimately the way people see the world.
Yeah, I know we had a bunch of clients that asked when Parler was taken down off AWS, the natural question was, should we be multi-cloud?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I'm not worried about AWS taking me down, but, this brings up an interesting point. All of my eggs are in one basket. If they go away, does my company go away, or do I need to be multi-tenant? Do I need to be in GCP and Azure as well, and maybe some on-prem stuff? So there's been this pendulum swing to centralization, social media, money, the monetary system, which we'll get into, cloud service providers, the way we operate as a society, largely centralized banks, centralized social media, centralized internet service providers, centralized cloud. The pendulum's way over there. And I think what I've heard you and others talk about is maybe a more moderate stance is a healthy dose of decentralization. So can you talk about that? What is decentralization when it comes to the internet?
Yeah, so decentralization takes on a few different forms. There are schools of thought around each of them. The first and most obvious form of decentralization is what's called federation. And all federation means is that there is a service or platform or site, whatever it is, digital commodity that you can take control of if you so choose to. So analogous to Facebook, say there was a platform that was like Facebook, but it was federated. You could stand up your own server and you could have people join it. You could use it yourself, and people could post photos. They could post little status messages. They could share articles. They could do whatever they wanted using this platform. But because you control the server, you don't run the risk of, at least from a server hosting perspective, being shut down if you are saying or doing something that a third-party entity that would control a centralized service would not want you to do or say.
So I think one of those examples is I think there's Mastodon. Mm-hmm. That's a pretty popular decentralized server. So if you wanted to have Ryan Basden Universe and I wanted to have Christian Hyatt Universe, we could each stand up our own semi-private social media site. And then if we chose to, we could federate between the two of us and allow our users to communicate, for example.
Exactly.
So that's pretty popular. So there's social media. What else? What are other use cases? I know the blockchain, for example, and cryptocurrency is like an example of decentralization and being used to do like incentivized P2P networks. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So I won't dive too much into blockchain tech. One, for fear of misspeaking, two, for fear of somebody who knows a whole lot better than me correcting me after the fact. But in essence, the idea of having a blockchain is having a shared ledger that maintains the records for financial transactions. It could very easily be simple entries into something that needs to be tracked. And this can be extended into all kinds of things. So one of the biggest ways we've seen that done is with Bitcoin, cryptocurrency. And there are other cryptocurrencies that are built on blockchains. and there are nuances to those, but again, I'm not an expert in all of those. But what that created, when Bitcoin was created and it was built on blockchain technology, what happened is that suddenly there was no bank in the middle that was monitoring the transactions between this person who had Bitcoin and this person who had Bitcoin. They could exchange monetary value for services or goods, and there was no middle point. So banks, clearing houses, credit card companies, they were all out of the equation. So this brought on the possibility of privacy. People could spend money with each other or with perhaps vendors that were willing to take Bitcoin, and they didn't have to worry about someone sitting in the middle and taking that transaction and putting it towards an ad profile, for example, or tracking it in any other way that would be either exploitative or malicious.
Yeah, one of the things that interests me that I think could be revolutionary is we have this pendulum swing to the cloud service provider as your infrastructure to host a SaaS platform, let's say. And I've heard or had some clients ask about, what about using these distributed cloud providers that are kind of blockchain based, which essentially they create peer-to-peer networks. So everyone with a laptop or a computer could share and be part of the data center or part of that cloud infrastructure. And they could perhaps earn some cryptocurrency while doing that, but at least leverage the blockchain to create a ledger of the data and make that data private and secure and reassembled. So if I'm hosting all of my data on a blockchain-based P2P cloud environment, it's theoretically secure because it exists spread out across a large blockchain and can only be reassembled in a secure manner. I think that's interesting because there's a lot of questions about how resilient are those solutions. How highly available are they? So are they going to make snappy SaaS products, or are they the performance going to be terrible? We don't know. Also, what are the security considerations when it comes to those types of products? When you hear, if clients or folks are asking us, hey, what do you think about these distributed cloud service providers? Can you talk maybe a little bit about what are some of the risks associated with that in today's climate?
I think right now, the first thing I think of is that it's all just so new. I mean, how long ago was it that we were still operating in the data center mentality, right? A website is built on a server that sits in a huge warehouse next to other servers, and there are techs walking around making sure that the servers aren't blowing up and there's redundancy and all that stuff. And also it's 200 feet underground, right? Then AWS came along and Azure came along, these cloud services that still use that infrastructure, but started to change things. And what we've seen commonly is the way people use AWS typically falls into one of two categories. Either they fully embrace the idea of cloud infrastructure and they start using AWS services like Lambda or CloudFormation to totally revamp the way they do infrastructure, or they just migrate all of their old infrastructure out of the data center and into AWS. And it's just the same thing with an Amazon wrapper. I think that the move to decentralized storage and decentralized infrastructure like that will be similar. I think that it will present such a different dynamic that it will change the way people have to think about computing, and it'll change the way people have to think about the way they deploy infrastructure. It's not going to be good enough to just say, well, I want to run my servers here, and maybe that will be possible, but that sort of it pushes away the original intent.
Yeah, I mean, I think of things like the talent shortage, just like with cloud, right? It's like, is there a critical mass of individuals who understand how to leverage this technology? The other thing that concerns me is like a lot of these kind of P2P cloud-based, distributed cloud-based organizations are doing a lot of their own one-off cryptocurrencies, which have been notorious for like pump and dump schemes or they go under completely. So there's some questions: is this technology around to stay, Or is there some unique risk in terms of this business losing credibility in the marketplace and totally going under? So that kind of stuff I find worrisome. There's also like the regulatory perspective. Like I think about things like GDPR or ISO 27001. Take GDPR that says, sometimes there's data localization requirements. So my data has to be housed in the EU, for example. Well, if I'm on a distributed blockchain and some of that data from the peer-to-peer network is also in the US, or maybe I have no idea where it is, can these kind of archaic regulations adapt themselves to be reinterpreted using new technology? And there's always a little bit of a learning curve there. So there's probably some legal and regulatory risk that I think of. But I also think there's huge opportunity in terms of like individual privacy, which is something that I know you're big on. So how, are you using decentralized stuff today? Like what do you think the impact is or the use cases for, the common person that wants a little bit more privacy in their life?
Sure. So to address your first question, I think that so you mentioned GDPR. I think that regulations can adapt, but I don't think that's the pertinent question. I think the question is if they have to, and I think the answer is absolutely yes. This is the way technology is going, and we've seen how slowly existing standards that you and I work with every single day have adapted to cloud technology. The jump from traditional infrastructure to cloud technology, I think, is a lot smaller than the jump from what we have now to decentralization. It's a complete rethink of the way everything works. It's not a close cousin or a logical upgrade. It's a whole different way of thinking. And so it's not if they adapt, it's when they adapt, because they will have to. Otherwise, they'll become less and less applicable, or new standards will have to be written. There's plenty of ways to do it, but it'll have to be done, is the point. To answer your second question, I do use decentralized platforms for various things. The one I use the most is called Matrix. And what I mean by Matrix, I'm actually referencing a protocol. Matrix is an end-to-end chat voice platform, end-to-end encrypted, that also has federation capability. So if you wanted to, you could stand up your own Matrix server or Matrix instance in the same way that you can do with Mastodon or Pleroma or any other platform that is part of what's called the Fediverse, right? The universe of federated or federatable platforms and applications. And I use that for chat with a number of my friends because it's, again, decentralized. We use a single instance, or some of my friends actually use their own instances. But what's great about this is that those instances can talk to each other. I don't have to be using the same instance as a friend of mine in order to exchange messages. It's two federated services in that instance, connecting to each other. We hold the keys, touching on the privacy part that you mentioned. The encryption keys are in the hands of only us, and we know that because both the client application software, whatever application you're using to connect to Matrix, because it's just a protocol. It's like email. You can use any mail client you want to send an email, but it's still email at the bottom. It's still IMAP, SMTP, Dovecot, whatever, right? So we hold the keys. We know that because the application software is open source, freely open source. The kicker is that we also know the server software is open source. So what differentiates a federated service like Matrix, any Matrix instance, whatever form it takes, and maybe Signal, the end-to-end encrypted messaging app that's gotten a lot of press lately, is that Signal still has centralized servers. And that's not inherently a problem, except that it's a degree of uncertainty. And so when you own the keys, you own the encryption, you know that there's no midpoint that's controlled by a third party, then there's more assurance there. And you can see every bit of code, everyone who cares, we hope we never run out of these people who care enough to dive into the source code, are verifying independently by review of it that you can guarantee your messages are encrypted and they can't be intercepted and decrypted in the middle. Yep.
I mean, how hard is it for you to set something like that up? Like, is it something that takes a day to set up, or is that an hour-long job? What does that look like if someone wants to get into it?
It depends on the service. I will say it gets easier and easier as days go by. It's well documented. So another federated service that I'm working on using is actually I forgot the name of it. It's a photo sharing app that's meant to mimic Instagram. I've been thinking about spinning it up so I could showcase photography, which is a hobby of mine, but it's entirely federated. And I know that their setup is supposed to only take 15 to 30 minutes. All these services typically have companies that will do the hosting for you. They'll do the hard part. But the true spirit of federation is owning the entire instance. So spinning up a virtual private server, installing the software, configuring it. Oftentimes this is not very difficult. These platforms are being engineered to be accessible. There's no gatekeeping for technical people. They're not trying to keep regular users out. If anything, they're trying to bring this to regular users as fast as possible. You don't need, the idea is for you to not be technical. You don't have to be technical to take advantage of decentralization.
Yeah, I know there's like a trend of individuals that want to get off the big social media platforms but don't want to be disconnected from their peers or their family. So there's opportunities to kind of stand up these more decentralized platforms that you can control. The one that comes to mind for me is Mastodon, because I know about it. But the Matrix protocol, you said that that's a protocol, not an application. So can you kind of expand on that? Like you can use it on any app, or what is that?
Sure. So email is the best example I have. So you and we have email addresses that are at risk360.com, right? Those, our email server lives somewhere. We send and receive email through that server, but we could send that to any old Gmail address, for example. But Gmail, that lives on a different server. We don't share a server, right? It's like, we don't even, there's no shared entity between that Gmail account and our risk360.com email addresses. But because email and the protocols that make up email are universally applied, they can be used in all kinds of ways, we don't have to worry about that. So Matrix is essentially that for messaging. If you have a smartphone app, for example, Element is a popular one, formerly known as Riot.im, now known as Element. Element can be on my phone, as it is, because again, I use Matrix. I can have that on my phone, and I can send a message to someone on a separate instance who is using an entirely different app to read their messages. And they can get it, and they can send me a message back. And it doesn't matter if we're using the same instance or not. It doesn't matter if we're using the same application or not. I can send you an email to your Gmail account from my Outlook account, and you'll still get it.
So I guess the theory is that if this protocol took off, you could build apps where the underlying protocol is Matrix, and you could have a cross application communications theoretically. I could have Christian Hyatt app, you could have Risk360, you could have Risk360 app, you could have Ryan Basden app, and we could all communicate with each other securely if the underlying protocol was Matrix. And I think you said the thing there is, I guess it puts the cryptography under the control of the individual. Is that the power of that technology?
Yeah, you have, the encryption is still handled by the protocol and in a sense the application itself to different degrees, but because the source code, every bit of operation that platform or that protocol is undertaking can be viewed and audited. So in that sense, maybe the encryption isn't being handled on your phone. In some cases it is, but you have complete visibility into the process. Therefore, you have influence over it. You have, if you have complete clarity over it, then that's more than what you have with a centralized service.
So you talked about Matrix kind of for communication protocols. Are there other like emerging technologies that you find interesting from a decentralization perspective that others might find interesting as well?
There are, and I'll use another messaging app as an example. There's a pretty niche application right now that, as far as I know, only exists on Android. I could be wrong about that. Don't quote me there. But it's called Briar. And this is where I diverge and talk about the different kinds of decentralization. So there's federated decentralization, which is the one we've been talking about mostly, where you can stand up your own instance and it can talk to other instances. There's also completely peer-to-peer. So there is no centralized server. There is no really instance in the middle. There is just you and me and whatever is linking us. So in this case, Briar is a small time in rapid development application that uses the Tor network to encrypt and send messages from one endpoint to another. And it's entirely peer-to-peer. In fact, one of the things that's been used for heavily is in other parts of the world under authoritarian regimes to communicate locally, because you can do it over Bluetooth. You just need to be next to somebody and you're able to communicate through Briar. It's allowed for communication within vicinity across all kinds of networks, bypassing censorship, bypassing blocks. And because there's nothing in the middle, in the same way that like the Tor network, the way the Tor network operates, there are just a bunch of other endpoints in the middle. There's no centralized server. The message is still delivered, the communication is still happening, but there's nothing in the middle. That's entirely peer-to-peer. So that's one particular platform that I'm very excited about. I check on it probably more than I'm willing to admit, just because I like to see where it's going.
As like a ethical hacker, pen tester, security researcher, are there any like clear holes in decentralized technology that like if a company were to switch to that for messaging or for cloud hosting or anything else that stick out to you, or is it largely a similar security and threat environment as a traditional centralized system?
I don't think it's similar. I think a lot of where it sits, you have to look at this in layers, right? So a vulnerability in, to use my example of Matrix from earlier, a vulnerability in the element application is not a vulnerability in Matrix, right? A vulnerability in a particular Matrix instance is not a vulnerability in another instance. So because it's comprised of several different component parts, it's hard to say. What I will say is that decentralization is meant to remove single points of failure, which is a common problem when assessing security, especially on traditional networks. There's on an Active Directory network, there's the central point of control, the domain controller or domain controllers. If there's a problem with that, there's a problem with everything.
Yeah, do you think so I guess the balance, if I'm an organization, is corporate control. Like I know that if I have an AD, Active Directory network, and I have traditional file storage and monitoring tools, I can basically govern my employees. I think some of the fear stems from if, like, let's say I set up a P2P network internally, maybe I lose some of that control and decentralization or centralization that you want as a governance structure. Do you think there's a balance there for an organization? Are there legitimate use cases for decentralization if I'm a business?
I think there is. I think the inherent security that comes with it is obviously an added benefit. I think that I'm not a complete decentralization anarchist, perhaps much to the dismay of people who might listen to this. I see the use case for federation. I think federation really hits that sweet spot for businesses who maybe can't just relinquish control, because having a business full of people using computers and phones is a big job. It's a big job. It's hard to manage. It's hard to keep secure. You have to staff people on it. So there's a degree of relinquishing control in the same way that we've seen with maybe moving from in-house applications that have been popular in the past couple decades to using SaaS products. So, we use Asana internally, right? Instead of having an in-house app to do task and project management, we trust our task and project management to a SaaS company. I think that it will be a similar shift in that maybe there is some relinquishment of control, in that maybe you can't necessarily determine the applications that people are using. If let's say you stand up a Matrix instance to replace Slack or Teams or whatever you're using, then maybe you don't have control over the platform, but if you're using one of those other offerings, did you ever also? Because it's a SaaS product. So achieving the secure by design benefit, incorporating that into your business technology stack, doesn't necessarily mean relinquishing control.
Fair enough. I'm going to shift gears a little bit, and if you don't mind disclosing to us some stuff I'm curious about. So privacy is obviously, or maybe not obviously, but it is something that I think a lot about, my individual privacy. I don't have a Facebook account. I have a LinkedIn. I have a Twitter. I feel like that's pretty curated content that I can control. I don't live on those platforms outside of some push updates. I am concerned about, for example, Google and YouTube tracking me. I'm concerned about Amazon and Alexa. My daughter had a 7th birthday recently, and somehow Amazon is recommending me 7-year-old birthday balloons, which is a little creepy. I'm worried about my fitness apps tracking me. I'm worried about the power that Amazon and AWS has, because I'm heavily embedded in AWS and Amazon services. I think a lot about these things, and I think the public consciousness is also shifting as such, where others are thinking about this too. Whereas if you asked 5 years ago, my mom didn't care about the free app on her phone that was tracking her. But today, I think she thinks about that, or at least she is aware enough about it to ask me about, hey, is this a good app or a bad app? So that's a cool shift in public consciousness. And with the politics recently, we talked about Parler being removed, and people are all over Facebook, like what kind of ads are they being served, getting beat up plenty. Where I'm going with this is there's probably some practical things that one can do to without being overly disruptive in their life, they can voice their privacy. And I know that this is something that you're conscious about and you think a lot about. So could you talk about, like, if you're advising, the average Joe on the street, what are some steps that someone can take? One, maybe just to get a little more privacy back in their life in terms of phone usage, apps, email, and then also, are there opportunities for decentralization there that people should consider? But decentralization being the second priority. I really just want some of your tips on leading a more private lifestyle online.
Sure. So this is a rabbit hole, because something as simple as having an application on your phone, which for a lot of people is the only way they access that platform, something as simple as that can be a huge threat to privacy. One of the things we saw with TikTok recently was that the application itself had access to your entire system clipboard. So even if you were opening your banking app, and maybe you were setting up your banking app with a direct deposit because you just got a new job, right? You were sending over your bank information, your routing number, and your accounting number. You copy and pasted that from your banking app into wherever you had to put that in. TikTok had access to that information because it was on your clipboard. So TikTok, just by nature of being on the phone, had access to that information. For a lot of people, they copy and paste passwords. I'm sure there are much more sensitive things that are copy and pasted if you were to...
Text messages, a lot of private communications, right?
If you were to sample the entire world, I'm sure it gets worse than that.
I don't want my private text messages to my wife on our anniversary that I'm copying and pasting going through.
Neither do I.
To be funny, yeah.
So
it's not hard to imagine why that wouldn't be great.
Right, and it's funny because on the surface, a lot of people will say, well, I don't really have anything to hide. But I love the Glenn Greenwaldism where he says, okay, well, if you have nothing to hide, then when you get home, email me all the passwords to your email accounts and your social media accounts. And, if you have an iCloud account, I'd love to look at your photos. And then people start to get really uncomfortable with that. And they're like, I don't want to do that. And it's well, okay, maybe you do have something to hide. You just don't realize it yet. So there are answers and there are not. TikTok was only revealed because somebody looked. So if no one had looked into it, we wouldn't know that TikTok was potentially, again, we don't know this, but potentially harvesting information from people's copy-paste clipboards on their phones.
So walk me through your like tech stack, because I'm thinking like platform by platform. Like, do you have a smartphone?
I do.
Okay, so smartphone, iPhone, Android, don't care which one. Obviously, there's tons of leakage going on for most users, native to the operating system or the apps that you install. Right. So is there like a set of hardening procedures that you do when you get a new phone?
There are. So first off, I use Android, but I do not use a version of Android that is shipped by a manufacturer or by even Google, really, in a sense. So when you buy a Samsung phone, there is a version of Android on that phone that has been tweaked, configured, added to, removed from by Samsung to make it unique to a Samsung phone. Otherwise, why buy Samsung over HTC or a Google Pixel even? And what I mean by it not being maintained by Google is I have stock Android on my phone, specifically a version called Graphene OS, which is a version of Android because, again, Android as a project is open source completely. The version of Android you might get on a phone is not necessarily, but Graphene is. And Graphene is an implementation or a version of the open source Android project that specifically focuses on privacy. So I have this on my phone. It was easy to add. You can look up guides to it. It's not terribly difficult. It just takes a little bit of time. But what it allows me to do...
So Ryan Basden buys a phone. Step one is uninstall native operating system. Reinstall Graphene OS, because that's one you feel comfortable in. All right, so you have the new operating system installed. What's next? What apps are you downloading? What apps are you not downloading? How are you communicating with people?
Sure. So as far as Graphene goes, and this is true for all Android, you can even install F-Droid, the open source app repository, on a regular old Android phone. You don't have to have something special like Graphene or Calyx OS is another one. But F-Droid works really well with open source privacy focused distributions of Android. I'll call them distributions using the Linux terminology. Because all of the apps on the F-Droid store are open source themselves. So
F-Droid is an alternative to the Google App Store. Is that right? Okay, got it.
So I'll even show you here. So my Android phone looks like any other old Android phone. There's nothing, it's not a bunch of green text on a black screen, right? I'm disappointed, but okay. I can make it that way for you if you want. It's usable, it's friendly, it looks nice, it has that Google Metro theme, but the apps that I use are all open source. And people think, oh, well, does that mean that I have to know how to code? Absolutely not. That would defeat the entire purpose. I have a mail app that I have all my email accounts on. I can read my email. I can respond to emails. I have a calendar app. I have Matrix or Element installed so that I can message people using the Matrix instance that I use. I can make calls. I can send text messages. I can do all of that stuff without sacrificing any usability. Now, I can't install apps from the App Store, which rules some things out. So Facebook has not open sourced their app. Twitter has not open sourced their app. A lot of the platforms that are used are only usable via the App Store. So there are some sacrifices that have to be made. But it's for the better, right? We're talking about decentralization. We're talking about taking your privacy back, taking hold of digital freedom that you didn't otherwise have. It requires a little bit of sacrifice, but it is attainable.
I would argue that sometimes that's a pro. Like, give me a great excuse not to have Facebook and Twitter on my phone. That's great. And often you can access those if you really need to through a web browser temporarily. So that's always an option. So get a phone, uninstall the OS, install Graphene,
put a little painter's
the
tape
App Store
over
F-Droid.
the front-facing camera.
Yeah. Remove ability for phone to spy on you via video. And then F-Droid is it exclusively open source on that app store?
Yes. So there will be, from time to time, an app that maybe uses a third-party location service, or another miscellaneous service that is not entirely privacy-friendly. But again, they have a level of, I don't want to call it anti-freedom, but they have certain features that they're willing to admit to the F-Droid store for functionality's sake. So, for example, there are some applications on the F-Droid store that will act. You mentioned fitness trackers, right? They will use your GPS and track your position, but that's because you're going on a run and you want to know what your splits were, right? So you have to track that somehow. There's no ethereal, open source, decentralized way to do that. Sometimes an app just has to use the GPS.
Well, that's like a privacy principle. Like you only access the data you need to perform that service. Right. So it makes sense from a fitness app perspective. I want to know what my splits are, so I clearly want you to have my GPS data. So this might be intuitive to some, it might not be, but the app store you mentioned is open source. Why do you care? Like, why does it matter that it's open source? What are the advantages of that from a privacy or security perspective?
I want to know that the email application I use is not sending the contents of my emails that I send to some company that can be looked at by anyone. I want to know that when I take a photo of, something funny that I see and I send it to my wife, that it's not being sent to Google and fed through an AI engine so that the AI can learn to recognize whatever I was in my picture. There's a degree of certainty and privacy that allows people to be who they really are. People are not their true selves when they're being watched. This has been demonstrated time and time again through study after study. George Orwell understood it really well with the idea of the panopticon, right? It's like someone sits at the top, it's so high up that you can't see who's in there. In fact, you don't even know if you're being watched at the time, but you could be. And if you think you are, you'll act like you are. And so when you don't know who's looking at what you're sending, looking at, receiving in an application that's on your phone, you may act as if they are. And there's a lack of freedom that comes with that.
Yep, that's kind of funny. It reminds me of that science experiment. I can't remember. It's like the split experiment where the laws of physics change under observation. It's like maybe the universe is trying to tell us something with that. But okay, so got it. You got open source. I mean, open source is generally peer reviewed. Anyone can look to see if an app's good or bad. Hypothetically, it's open. It's for peer review. Now, if someone's kind of edging into this this lifestyle, I'll say, like trying to be more privacy conscious, they're using less traditional app stores and operating systems. I always worry about, like, if I'm going to tell my mom to do this, like, there's also things I don't want you to do. Like, maybe I don't want you installing an operating system that's sketchy. And I kind of know how to identify that, but maybe she doesn't. So she might not know the difference between, this, virus-infected operating system versus graphene, which is a totally legitimate one. So for others kind of pursuing this path and thinking about giving it a shot, are there some tips along the way that you might recommend just for, a good path that's safe, not taking on too much risk, well-vetted apps versus, I might install something on my phone that's actually worse than, the one everyone uses, this known spy. Any tips you have there?
Sure. So we're lucky because these things have huge communities around them. And if you look hard enough, you will find that there are, whether they are decentralization platforms or smartphone operating systems or even just regular old apps, there are people who use and talk about their successes and failures with them. So, if I don't want to just say that this is a guarantee, but the more people who are looking at something like Graphene OS, the better assurance you can have that it is secure, it's been looked at, people are constantly looking at it.
So you're generally looking for something with a sizable community around it. So it has a good peer review system, basically. Yep. Anything to avoid? Are there specific sites, like would you recommend that someone go download Tor, or no, are there like specific things that you would recommend people not pursue?
You know, download Tor if it's from the Tor project. if you're going to download Tor, download it from the Tor project. They have a repo on F-Droid, so if it's on F-Droid, you can probably trust it. I don't want to give a guarantee there, but probably. That's a good question.
They can, it's like freedownloads.com,
well, yeah.
Lots of spam.
Yeah, don't download more RAM on your phone. You can't download RAM, right? General rules of thumb: if it looks too good to be true, it probably is.
Yeah, so all the comments and stuff.
Yeah, if it's fed to you in an ad, like you found out about it because of an advertisement, I don't know. I don't want to land too hard on that one because there are some great platforms that are actually running ads now.
I love that if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is, because that's like rule of thumb. But I mean, just to kind of recap, because some of this is brand new information to me, I think the Graphene OS sounds great. It's very well reviewed, tested by you, who I trust. You got the F-Droid App Store. Sounds like that's generally a good place to grab stuff from, so it's a good first start. And then if I'm downloading apps or technologies that I'm unfamiliar with, look for a sizable community, a good ecosystem of peer review, and if I stick to those three, I'm probably pretty good as a place to start.
Yeah, one of the nice things about F-Droid repos, just as a small note, is that you can view the source code directly from the app page. And again, you don't have to be a developer, but GitHub, which is where most of these applications exist, have a great system called the star system. So if you are downloading an app and you go click the link to view the source code, and it takes you to a GitHub page, and it has thousands of stars, clearly thousands of people like it. Now, can thousands of people be wrong? Absolutely. But you have a better chance of succeeding with that one than maybe something that has 0 stars, has not been looked at by anybody. This is all available at your fingertips, literally, if you want to.
Yeah, awesome. So last thing I do want to talk about, so thanks. I'll take some of these recommendations into consideration on my own phone. Is you have a cool project that I want to talk a little bit about, and I know you've been working on it on and off for a while, the Kraken project, or whatever you want to call it, which is a project that you have, I guess, contributed back to the pen test community to try to provide some tool sets. So can you talk a little bit about that, and then where can we find it?
Sure. So the way this started, as a pen tester, one of the things I found myself doing a lot was cracking passwords. And thankfully, to the benefit of everybody, passwords have gotten progressively harder and harder to crack over time. The amount of computing power and time and energy required to do it is increasing, which is good for everybody. But in order to succeed as a pen tester, I need to be able to crack passwords. So what we found ourselves doing was pricing out these huge password cracking rigs, linking up 20, 30 GPUs, graphic cards, together, and thinking, okay, should we spend $20,000 on this, or can we get away with $15,000? And that was just not viable. It wasn't viable. It was too much to set up. It was going to be too much upkeep. And then we realized that cloud services exist. And cloud services are not only insanely cheap for small periods of time, but they allow access to some of the most powerful hardware available in the world at the moment. So we thought, well, we should just start using these cloud services. That's exactly what we started doing. We started spinning up a server that had a bunch of GPUs attached to it, so we had a massive amount of password cracking power. We would try and crack passwords. When we were done, or we didn't get any results, we would spin the server down, and we could do the whole thing in 30 minutes to an hour, and only end up paying maybe $20 or $30 to crack some passwords. instead of $15,000 or $20,000, right? So the problem with that was it was taking some time, and we had to wait for the server to spin up. We had to go into the AWS console because that's where we built it first, and it was just cumbersome. And so what my friend Stefan Becker and I wanted to do was following the true hacker mentality, in fact, even a bit of the regular old Unix philosophy, because we're geeks. We wanted to be able to do everything from the command line. So we wanted to be able to spin up a server, crack a password, and get the result all from the command line. So that's what we built. And we were able to write a set of scripts and effectively kind of an API call that would feed our password hashes, our uncracked passwords, to a server, spin it up. As soon as it was finished, it would shut itself down, and we ended up being able to do what we did in about an hour in about 6 or 7 minutes beforehand. So we would get access to these hugely powerful password cracking rigs for cents on the dollar, and we would have just as much success, if not more success, than people who are using these giant rigs. And it was all open source, and we built it so that it could be deployed by anybody. Anybody could take this script and with some AWS keys could do it themselves and, unintentionally ruin the GPU rig market.
So if someone wants to get a hold of this, your fellow ethical hackers and pen testers, where could they go to get that? Is it in GitHub?
It is in GitHub. It is technically a private repo right now, but it could be easily made public. I don't know how you would want to do it, but it would exist on my GitHub first. So if we wanted to share that some way, we could.
So look for RISC-360 Labs or Renegade Labs on GitHub, and we'll get Ryan to publish some stuff that he's creating. Awesome. Great, man. This is an awesome conversation. I'm looking forward to the new decentralized internet and seeing all the technology that comes out. Thanks for sharing some information about how to be more private and secure the phone, and we'll check out your GitHub project.
Happy to do it. Thanks,
Mr. Basden.
Yeah.
Great conversation. Talk soon.
Yep.